Hi, and welcome to the Classic Guitar Rock Update, TGIF edition for Friday, March 3rd, 2023. I am Jeremy, and thank you so much for tuning in. Please email me, classicguitarrock@mail.com. I'd love to share your email and hear from you on our updates. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at Classic Guitar R1. That's at Classic Guitar R1. And we are also on Facebook and Rumble. You can check us out there. I got a few emails and then one big item in the news. I guess it's not really news. It kind of a slow classic rock news day. It has been the past couple days. Sadly, a lot of the updates I've had have been talking about people passing away, which is not my intention. But today, in fact, we'll talk about someone who passed away on this date way back in 2012. We'll get to that here in a moment. Let's get to some emails here. It looks like I've got 3 of them today. So, hi CGR guys. Now that it has kind of come and gone, what are your thoughts about the whole Seattle grunge thing? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? I gotta be honest, I was never a big grunge fan. I much prefer classic rock or even butt rock to the whole grunge scene. Butt rock, for those that aren't familiar with that, is kind of like hair metal, right? It's kind of the same thing. Waiting for your response. That's from Blake. Blake, thank you so much for your email. I do have some thoughts about grunge. And it's funny you mentioned that. I've been watching recent interviews. There's a channel on YouTube. Oh gosh, I thought I would remember. It's like recycled 80s metal or something. I can't remember the name. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the channel. But they've got great content where they interview a lot of 80s, folks. I was watching an interview the other night with Bobby Blotzer. Who else? John Corabi, George Lynch. I've watched several interviews with these folks, but there's a common thread in a lot of those interviews. And those of you that weren't old enough to live through it might not be aware. Grunge, it was a dagger. It was a dagger to hair metal, to the hard rock at the time. No one thought that this this new sound coming out of Seattle with bands like obviously Nirvana, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, everyone thought it was just okay. It's just kind of a new little style of music. It's still hard rock, right? No one knew that it would completely overturn the rock and roll apple cart, because by about 1991, traditional status quo hard rock bands, they were done. I mean, record companies weren't interested. And in fact, one of the things, I can't remember if it was George Lynch, might have been an interview with Robert Mason. I can't remember, but one of those interviews, the guys made the point, super valid point. And that is what record companies do. Movie companies are the same way. And you've seen this. You see this pattern all the time. And let's use the Beatles as an example. Well, the Beatles came out in, 64, 63, 64. Beatlemania officially started in the US in 64. So a band like the Beatles comes out. Nothing like that had been seen before. So what do all the record companies do? Well, they rush out to make their own version of the Beatles, right? So then all of a sudden you got the Rolling Stones, and you've got the Kinks, and you've got the Dave Clark Five, and you got all these bands that look alike, right? They've got the same style. That's not to say these bands that came later weren't good. Some of them were very good, right? And the bands that are truly talented tend to rise to the top, right? But that was what you had to have, right? We need a Beatles, right? And I've talked about the Quiet Riot album, Metal Health. Metal Health kicked open the door that kind of started hair metal, because then at that time, after that was popular, then they're signing every band from LA that wore spandex, right? Same type of deal. Grunge comes along, and to be honest, you know what? It happened in the 70s with the punk music, right? The big rock bands had become really overblown and bloated and pretentious, even though I love a lot of that stuff. But I mean, you had like Led Zeppelin, and you had, you know, Deep Purple, and just the excess and everything. The albums were taking 2 years to produce and all of this stuff. And then all of a sudden this punk movement comes in the mid 70s and kicks them all to the curb for a while. And that kind of became the soup of the day, right? Grunge comes along. Here's hair metal that had become formulaic. A lot of the bands sounded the same. They looked the same. So it needed to be shaken up. I mean, that's the way it's always been in music. We get these every few years, there's a disruptor that comes along. Grunge was the great disruptor, bigger than most, right? Because it really did level. And when I say level, I mean flattened a lot of the traditional hard rock bands. And you hear these interviews over and over that, you know, yeah, we had just signed a deal and we were going to start producing our album in 1991, and then grunge happened. Okay, so all of a sudden there was no interest from record companies in bands that weren't grunge. And that happened for a few years in the 90s. So was grunge good? Or there were some exceptions. Metallica was popular for that whole time, right? They survived grunge. But even they had some of that grunge ethic in terms of look at the way Metallica dressed versus the Sunset Strip bands, right? So they kind of had that credo of grunge, you know, jeans, t-shirts, right? They didn't get into the makeup and all that crap, which is probably a good thing. But you know, grunge was a reaction to what was going on with the record companies, you know, in 1990, right? And it was ripe. It was ripe to be picked off, right? Now, as a hard rock, classic rock fan, I was kind of sad because I was into Guitar Shred. You know, I was into all these bands at the time that had great guitar players, and Steve Vai and Joe Satriani. I loved all that stuff. And that was kind of became a kiss of death in the early 90s, is we went from, you know, technical guitar playing and all this flashy stuff to 3 chords, right? 3 jangly, semi out of tune chords on the Nirvana albums, right? And some people loved it. Some people hated it. It happened. I mean, it's history. Whether you liked it or not, that's the way it went. So was grunge a good thing? I don't know. Was it a bad thing? I don't know. It just was. I mean, that's what happened. I guess one thing that has changed is record companies don't have the power that they used to have. I mean, artists can now produce a record in their bedroom, right? The technology exists that you can produce your own album, put it out there, and become successful selling it. You don't need record companies. The whole strategy of record companies has changed. Radio is different. Is that good? In some ways it's good, in some ways it's bad, but it just is. And I know I'm not really giving you an answer. My own preference is I wasn't a huge grunge fan. I mean, with some exceptions, you know, I kind of dug Stone Temple Pilots. I had Bad Motor Finger. I had Soundgarden, you know, and it was okay. I preferred the classic rock. I preferred the flashy guitar playing and the harmonies and all of that came with the rock of the 70s and 80s. So I kind of missed that when that was no longer really in vogue. But you know what? Things happen. Each generation kind of has its own new thing, you know. I loved the new wave of British heavy metal when someone 10 years older than me might have hated it, right? They wanted their old 70s Eagles stuff. You know, they want to listen to the Eagles in America and all that, which I love that too. But my whole point is that things change, right? Music changes. Grunge was a change. And now many of those grunge bands are in the same boat that the old rock bands from the 80s are in, is that their stuff's not really in vogue anymore. So, it's subjective. Music is subjective. There will always be these movements in music that will make some things better and some things worse. It just depends on what your own thoughts are on it. So I don't know. I hope that kind of answered that question. I live in Washington State, by the way. So I was in Spokane right as grunge was really taken off, right? So in this part of the country, grunge was a big deal. I remember, gosh, in about 92, Queensryche. Remember in 90 or 91, they, Silent Lucidity, all that, they were at the top of the world. Well, Queensryche came and played in Spokane, and it's like, it was no big deal. I mean, people went. I think it was a free concert. If I remember right, I think a radio station sponsored a free Queensryche concert, and that wasn't what the kids were interested in. They wanted the grunge. Anyways, whatever it's worth. Okay, here's another one. And guys, this has nothing to do with music, but it's an email. I'm going to read it to you. I just hope I don't go on too big of a tangent. Hey, Jeremy, I noticed you and I follow the same YouTube channel about Bigfoot. I even saw you had a poll about Bigfoot on Twitter. Yeah, my poll question a few weeks ago was, do you believe that there's a Bigfoot species that actually exists? Do you believe in Bigfoot, basically? Do you believe Bigfoot exists? What do you think Bigfoot's favorite band is? Okay, that's from Aaron in the woods. I never thought I'd be talking about Bigfoot on here. So just full disclosure, I'm very interested in Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the whole thing. I live in the Pacific Northwest, which was kind of, at least when Bigfoot came into popularity in the 60s and 70s, it was all happening in, Northern California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia. So this is kind of Bigfoot ground zero. I own a place in Montana. I've spent a lot of time in Montana. That's very rural, very mountainous. And all you have to do is get in an airplane and fly across the western U.S. and you realize there are still thousands and thousands and thousands of square miles that are completely uninhabited. So there's lots of territory. I mean, there's probably lots of still parts of the western U.S. that no man has ever set foot in, right? So there's habitat. There's a lot of areas where some type of undiscovered creature could exist. I've never seen Bigfoot. But people I know and believe and respect have claimed to have seen something, right? So it's an interesting little hobby. I mean, I'm not a Bigfoot researcher or anything, but I do like to kind of follow that. And as I've listened to more and more researchers talk about it, and this is from anthropologists who are professors at universities to other people that are just interested in the topic and research it. And there's a whole spectrum of talk about Bigfoot, from the purely scientific college professor type that believe that Bigfoot is just a primate. It's an ape, right? It's a North American ape. To people clear on the other side that think it's a supernatural creature that teleports out of UFOs or whatever. I don't really necessarily get into all that stuff. But here's what I believe. And you can find stuff back into the late 1800s, newspaper clippings, articles where there was a tribe The other Indian tribes referred to a tribe called the Sasquatch, that was a tribe, that were people, right? Even in Europe, they talk about wild men. And what were wild men? Wild men were simply feral humans, wild men that lived out in the wild. And so my thought is, if the Sasquatch does exist, they're people, not animals, right? They're like, I don't know if they're human just like us or whatever, but I think they're more like us than like animals. And they're feral. They live in the wild. And if you were to put a domestic pig, just let it loose in the wilderness, they become feral very quickly. Their hair gets longer. They grow tusks. And so potentially maybe these Bigfoots or Sasquatches are just a group of people that remained wild. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I feel goofy talking about it, but Aaron, you asked. So anyways, I am kind of interested in that. So there's lots of YouTube channels if you want to go down the whole Bigfoot thing. So there you go. I don't think we'll ever talk about Bigfoot again on this channel. That's from Aaron in the Woods. All right, Aaron, thank you very much. Oh, who do you think Bigfoot's favorite band is? Well, that's easy. It would be Bachman Turner Overdrive. BTO would be Bigfoot's favorite band, of course. Okay, here's another one. Caught your update yesterday where you talked about Karen Carpenter. I, too, am a big fan. But the bigger point I wanted to share, and I have a feeling you'll agree, is that as I've gotten older, I'm finding I have a much more open mind about music and many other things, to be honest. I'll catch myself listening to stuff on the radio that I wouldn't have been caught dead listening to in the 80s or 90s. LOL. Am I maturing or just lowering my standards? Ha ha. Thanks for your YouTube channel. I hope it grows much bigger, and I think it will as more people find you. Well, thank you very much. God bless. That's from Kathy M., Casper, Wyoming. So, Kathy, thank you very much. And I do agree with you. I can relate. I think I've even mentioned on the channel that I'll hear some 80s tune. Bob, we have a station here, Bob FM, that plays, 80s. That's what they do. They play 80s music. And it's so funny. So many of the songs that when I was in high school, there's no way you'd catch me listening to a Duran Duran song, or a, Hall & Oates song. It was all metal all the time. Yeah. But now when I hear those songs that come on, Mr., even like a Wham song or something, I like singing along, now I love that stuff. And I think, to your point, as we get a little older, I think we probably do get a little more open-minded. And I think some of it is we don't tend to realize how good we have it until we don't have it anymore. So for an example, and I know I'll sound like the guy yelling at you to get off my lawn, right, when I say this. When I listen to new stuff on the radio, God, I just can't, I don't like it. I mean, I'm sure there's some good stuff out there. I just haven't heard it. But then I hear just a throwaway pop song from 1984. I'm trying to think of an example. I hear some song by Tears for Fears, which that's not a good example because they're actually pretty good. And I did kind of like them even back then. But a pop song from the 80s, even a Madonna song, right? Not a fan of Madonna now, but you even hear Borderline or a Madonna song on the radio and you go, that's a pretty catchy tune, compared to the crap you hear now. And the worst of all is modern country. Modern country blows. I mean, it's just really bad, with very few exceptions. I'll say that, but then I'll turn right around and say the best musicians in the world are in Nashville, right? But Nashville has become a factory, cranking out Velveeta, right? Processed cheese, because the country songs you hear, the new stuff, 95% of it is just crap. It's like, let's take a terrible pop song with auto-tune and sampling and all this crap, and let's just sing it with a hick accent. Yoo-hoo. Oh, I hate it. I can't listen to it. It's terrible. Let's squeeze in all the cliches we can into this song. It's terrible, terrible. Country music just sucks, and I said it. Modern country with doesn't mean there aren't some talented people, but the crap you hear on the radio for the most part sucks. But as we get older, as I get older, I am more open-minded. As I just ranted about how all new music sucks, I am more open-minded, mostly to the stuff that I didn't really appreciate, growing up. Now, when I hear that, I really like a lot of it, most of it. So, Kathy, thank you so much for your email. Please email me, classicguitarrock@mail.com. Now, a very sad but important commemoration today. On this date, back in 2012, the late, great Ronnie Montrose passed away. He died, he took his own life. He had been suffering from pancreatic cancer for months and months and months. And my understanding is pancreatic cancer is one of the most painful kinds of cancer you can. I'm not justifying suicide or anything, but I mean, just some context so that you understand what he was going through at the time. I love Ronnie Montrose. He was really ahead of his time. That first Montrose album, I've got several. If you go back a few years in my YouTube channel, I've got. I talk about. There's an episode about the Montrose album. I think there's an episode about the Gamma albums also. I really like the Gamma albums that he did. He was really ahead of his time. Super influential. It's fascinating to listen to that first Montrose album, which came out in 73. There is a podcast episode dedicated to the first Montrose album. That album in 1973 is about 10 years ahead of its time. You listen to it and then you compare it to another album from 73. Put it up against, I mentioned Bachman Turner Overdrive. You put it up against a Bachman Turner Overdrive album. And I love Bachman Turner Overdrive. But the guitar tone, the drum sound, everything about that Montrose album is light years ahead of a BTO album. It's just ahead of its time. It was the introduction of Sammy Hagar. And, I love to hear the stories about that album where Sammy basically just, went and knocked on Ronnie's door and said, "Hey, I hear you're starting a new band. Can I be in it?" And that's how it started, right? Sammy pulled out his notebook and they started singing songs together. And about half the songs, Sammy had already written, and it was just a matter of putting them together. And, the rest is history. Montrose never had huge commercial success, but he definitely inspired a lot of guitar players. Eddie Van Halen cites Ronnie Montrose as a big influence. Michael Schenker and Ronnie Montrose were actually kind of contemporaries because Schenker was already in UFO by 73, 74, and the first Montrose album came out in 73. But Montrose just had I use this word a lot when I think of Montrose, a very muscular style, right? A lot of, big bends, a lot of vibrato, and just a really cool tone. And he was just a great rock and roll guitar player. And if you can check out any interviews with him, he just seemed like a very interesting guy. One of our podcast episodes, we interview a gentleman who has a great YouTube channel about vintage, about classic TV shows. He actually he was Ronnie's touring guitarist for a few years, and you need to check out that episode because you get some more insight into what Ronnie was like as a person. But he left a big imprint, inspired a lot of people, left us several great albums, and I love to go in a Ronnie Montrose rabbit hole and watch all the interviews I can, watch the different live performances. He was just a great guy, and did things his own way. You know, I think with a lot of artists, they're not always the easiest folks to work with, because a lot of times they're perfectionists and they have a certain sound that they really want. And so sometimes we use words like, "well, they're difficult," or "they're whatever it is," and that may be. I never worked with them, so I don't know them personally, but I think that's kind of a common thread with artists, and I think, you know, he fell into that. He had a certain sound that he was looking for, and sometimes if that meant they were difficult to work with or perfectionists or whatever, so be it. But man, I love me some Ronnie Montrose. I love the first few Montrose albums. I love the Gamma albums, and a big loss when we lost him. So if you get a chance, listen to some Montrose, stream some Montrose today. If you have some vinyl, throw it on. That first Montrose album I would recommend to anyone. Rest in peace, Ronnie Montrose. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, shoot me an email, classicguitarrock@mail.com, and we will see you on the next Classic Guitar Rock update. Take care.